For this week's podcast, the topic with which I would like to discuss is kind of focused on theology, but kind of not. But for whatever reason, for better or worse, I have entitled this conversation "Living Above or Below." And what I'm going to be talking about briefly is living above your theology and living below your theology. I'm going to begin by talking about my theology. I have a theology which is the basis for my belief and the basis for my faith. I believe certain things to be the truth as far as I want to say the supernatural, or that beyond earth, or our reason and purpose for being in existence, my belief in God, my religious beliefs. Do I believe that my religious theology is correct? Yes. If I didn't, then I would have to change that which I call my foundations or my theology. But I do believe that my theology is correct. However, saying that, some of my beliefs, while I still believe them to be true, are perhaps broader, or should be broader than they actually are. Some of my theology may be too narrow. And this goes back to an idea that I've discussed with you before, was that we have built a box with which we put God. And God needs to fit in our box. Because no matter what your beliefs are, or your theology is, or your beliefs about God and how we should live our lives, once you summarize that or make a list of those things, you have built a box with which you have contained God, or with which your theology has contained God. One of the most difficult concepts for us to know and understand is that no matter how we describe God in our theology, we have created a box around that which we identify as God, spirituality, theology, our beliefs. Mine aligns most with Christianity. But no matter what we do with that box, God is not contained in that box. We don't really have the ability to know and understand all there is. We live in a very limit-driven existence. We are compelled to embrace finite, not infinite. Our ability to understand infinity, I want to say, is limited, but really is impossible. It's impossible for us truly to understand infinity. So no matter what we list as our beliefs, we must know and understand that however we have boxed God in, or however we have built our comprehension around the concept of God, no matter how we've done that, the very fact that we've done that has created a box with which God is in our box of our definition. And God is much bigger than that. Like, how dare we as humans even get up close to the idea that we know and understand God? Now, I do have some theological beliefs that are my foundation, and I do believe that they are correct. But I'm not going to be so bold as to say that anyone who defines God in a different way than I do must be wrong, because I have this box for God, and I have to know and understand that that box is bigger than what I have defined it to be. I grew up and learned that if you want to be a Christian, there are steps to follow. Number one, you do this. Number two, you do this. Number three, you do this. Number four, you do this. Number five, you better not do this. Number six, you better not do this. And so I grew up being taught and learning a series of steps to follow to be a Christian, to follow God's call in my life. I also grew up being taught and learned that people who didn't follow those same exact steps that I've got in my box are lost forever. And this is where I have difficulty today. I do believe that I'm right, but I also believe that God is bigger than the limits that I've tried to place upon God. So here's what I mean by that. No matter what your theology or beliefs about God is, somehow it's possible to live better than whatever your theologies are. And it's also better to leave, it's also possible to live below whatever your statements and beliefs are about God. I do believe that the number one thing that God calls us to, because Jesus came to share with people how they got it wrong. You guys believe all this about God, you've heard this, this, and this, but let me tell you what it really is. And I think the life lessons and teachings and modeling of Jesus is where the main points lie. We're supposed to love God with our whole self, and we're supposed to love our neighbors. And that sounds like a list with two things, but really is one thing. You love God and all that God created by loving and caring for all people and things. If God made me and God made you and God made these people over here, shouldn't I be showing the love of God? Because if God made them and God made you and God made me, if you matter to God, God created you. God loves you. How can I, as a human, mistreat you? Or how could I in any way say, you didn't follow the steps I have, so you're going to hell and I can't have anything to do with you? Even if I find fault with you, or if I think there are some things you need to change, I'm not God. How can I judge you, condemn you, and compare the evidence of your life on what I have in my box and say you've missed it? Now, I do have a theology, and I believe in this is the way things should go, but it's not my place to speak for God and tell you what's wrong. Okay, now that's kind of the foundation for the topic that I want to have a discussion about today, and that's living above or below. I think that there are people that live above their theology. I think there are people that demonstrate that they love God and they love all people, who may not have my set of core beliefs or my little checklist on you do step 1, 2, and 3 in order uh, to be worthy of God's love. But yet they are demonstrating that they have God's love by the way they love others and they care for others. Might they have some problems with their theological statements? Maybe. Might I have problems with my theological statements? Maybe. Some of you listening already have tuned out because you already find issue with some of my statements, although I haven't really shared my theological statements. I've just shared that they exist, and I've posed questions. Some of you have already tuned out because in the way I pose my questions or my wonderings, you're already pointing your finger at me and saying, Larry, you're way off. That's kind of the point of what I'm bringing out today. You're saying I'm way off without even knowing what my beliefs are. I'm just sharing with you some questions. I think there are people that show God's love and share God's love to the world. They may not have the theology that backs up what they're doing, but the actual way they live their life is by following the life, the lessons, and the models that Jesus gave to us. That's the way they love their neighbors. That's the way they love their families. That's the way they love people in their church. That's the way they love people in other churches. That's the way they love people who aren't very loving back to you. So there are people that if you ask them what their beliefs are, they would have their beliefs, and then you would say, oh my, because they have their own box. Maybe they don't define God at all, so they have no box for God. But more likely, they have a concept of God that with which their beliefs are grounded. So they've got their box over here. Here's my box. Here's maybe someone else's box. There are some people, they have their belief about God, and if you ask them, they might say that no, God does not expect us to love and care for other people. There are people that believe that. And yet, when you see how they live out, when you see how they live out their daily lives, they are loving and caring for people. So there are people that live above their theology and their beliefs. Uh, I know people that belong to certain denominations and churches that are very, very harsh to some groups of people. And if you ask them questions, they would respond with their denominational answers. They'd probably quote one of 7 scriptures from the Bible. And their theological responses would be very harsh and very limiting to God. They're speaking for God. They have this box around God. But when you see how they live out their lives and love and care for everyone around them, their actual living and serving others and loving others surpasses that of what's in their theological box. So that's what I call living above your theology, being more in line with God's call on us to love all people. They're doing a better job of that than what their theology would say. Unfortunately, it's also true that we have people that have all this right things, and when I say right according to my theological basis, and when you're thinking about people saying the right things in theology, then for you, right is because it agrees with your box. We have people that say all the right things, claim to believe all the right things, have good theology about God's love and what God calls us to do and be. But the actual actions and how they live out their lives, they are not concerned about people. They put limits on who they love and help based on a set of criteria that's human generated. They don't show love to people. They get happy when people are rounded up, shoved on buses and planes, and shipped somewhere else because they didn't come here in the right way, so we got to get rid of them. That's the opposite of what God calls us to do and be. And people that claim within their religious foundations and theology, and specifically I'm talking about Christianity here because that is my own personal faith. That is the major religious faith of the country in which I live. And that is the major faith with which our political candidates and leaders profess. But the actual carrying out and the evidence of their lives and their work and their speech and the things they do is living below that which they claim to contain. I didn't want to make this conversation only about criticizing the people that claim to be Christians and yet are doing all these horrible things, especially in the last few weeks. So many of the things that have come from our government have been the antithesis of anything that could remotely be considered Christian or godly. But it's also true that people that don't have theology that calls them to love and care for others, in fact, do. So there are people that live and carry out their lives better than what their beliefs call them to do, and there are people that fall below. Living below or living above. Whatever your theology is, are you doing a better job of that than what your beliefs actually are? Are you doing a better job than your theological answers to questions? Or are you doing worse than that? In whatever you do, you must, it's not optional, you must love your neighbors. You cannot hurt someone and say you're showing the love of Christ. It's just not possible. So, thank you for watching. If you engage with these conversations that I post on my podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Until next time.